Today, I'm talking about performance verification plans, otherwise known as PVPs. Next slide, please. As an overview for this presentation, I will be discussing 4 learning objectives regarding performance verification plans. I will explain what PVPs are and their purpose, and then describe when PVPs are required. I will also provide the details of PVP development and compliance requirements, discuss remediation types that determine when a PVP is required, and provide guidelines for the items to incorporate into PVPs. Next slide, please. Let's first discuss the purpose and importance of a PVP. Next slide. When a contaminated site requires risk controls to mitigate contaminant migration or ensure that there are no exposure pathways, a performance verification plan will be required. The PVP is a standalone document that describes the principal risk controls necessary to ensure that risk-based standards under the Contaminated Sites Regulation are met at a site. A PVP lays out the actions needed to ensure that these risk controls are implemented and maintained. There are many examples of risk controls that we will explore later in this presentation. Next slide, please. From a regulator's standpoint, we need PVPs to ensure that if risk assessment is used to remediate a site and risk controls are required to mitigate the risk to receptors, there is a plan in place to assure that these controls will be monitored and maintained. Thus, we have PVPs to support the development and compliance with risk controls included in ministry documents, such as an approval in principle or certificate of compliance, to support site reclassification from a high risk to a risk managed high risk site, or as a condition on a director's release notice. Next slide, please. I will now discuss protocols that require PVPs, risk controls, and define site types on the next few slides. Next slide, please. PVPs are required by these protocols. Protocol 1, detailed risk assessment. Protocol 6, applications for approved professional recommendations and pre-approvals. Protocol 12, site risk classification, reclassification, and reporting. And Protocol 13, screening level risk assessment. These protocols can be found on our website, and the link is shown here on the slide. And just to reiterate again, PVPs are required by these protocols when risk controls are necessary. Next slide, please. Risk controls are ways to reduce or remove the risk of exposure to human health and the environment from contamination. Risk controls may be institutional, for example, putting up signage so that people do not enter or use an impacted area, or they may be engineered, such as a pavement cover placed over shallow contaminated soil to eliminate the risk to humans and animals coming into contact with that soil. A risk control can also be a complex groundwater pump and treat system to mitigate contamination from entering a nearby aquatic receiving environment. Next, please. Contaminated sites may be classified as type 1 or type 2, based on the type of risk control needed to meet the Contaminated Sites Regulation risk-based standards. Type 1 sites generally do not require a PVP unless specified by the director. Type 2 sites that need institutional or engineering controls to manage risks require a PVP. Next slide, please. Type 1 contaminated sites are defined by the following circumstances. The first is that the site meets risk-based standards under current and future standards without any risk controls. Next. Secondly, the site has an institutional control for limiting the presence of future drinking water wells where the site is serviced by a treated municipal water supply. Next. And finally, a type 1 site can have an engineered control or a paved cap covering soil contamination in a municipal roadway or sidewalk. Next slide, please. Type 1 sites include instances where there are no risk controls. In this example, a site demonstrates no unacceptable risks in either a screening level risk assessment or a detailed risk assessment, even though operative exposure pathways exist. In other words, there are no adverse effects to receptors. Type 1 site examples also include two situations where there are some risk conditions in place. Firstly, an institutional control stating that groundwater from the site must not be used as drinking water, which could be a covenant on the land title. And secondly is when the site will remain a municipal roadway and the asphalt cap will be maintained on a routine basis. In this instance, the statutory decision maker can rely on municipal policies and procedures to maintain roads and sidewalks. Next slide, please. Type 2 sites are sites that meet risk-based standards under current and future uses through use of institutional or engineered risk controls. There are exceptions. PVPs are not required for the two risk controls noted for type 1 sites, as I mentioned on the earlier slide. Also, as discussed earlier, sites that are determined to be type 2 usually require PVPs. Next slide, please. There are many examples of type 2 sites. This slide lists some of them, and the list is not inclusive of all potential options. Some examples of institutional controls include fencing and signage restricting use, for example, no trespassing, lack of receptor occupancy or contractual restriction of receptor, for example, no daycares allowed on the site, or a land title restriction ensuring that there is no construction that will cause soil disturbance or a change in land use. Some examples of engineering controls may include a soil vapor barrier, pavement or a cap for deeper soil contamination, secure containment of leachable contaminated soil in a lined cell, groundwater or soil vapor extraction and treatment system, an engineered barrier system or a reactive wall, and finally, in situ and ex situ or groundwater treatment. In situ or ex situ soil or groundwater treatment. Next slide, please. So this is a poll. I wondered if Cindy, you could launch the poll. Oh, well, I'll read it out. So the poll question is, I'm going to read out a condition in a certificate of compliance, and if you can tell me if it requires a PVP, yes or no. Soil containing contamination must remain at a depth of at least 1 meter below the current grade of 10 meters above sea level and not be redistributed as surface soil. Changes in potential grade elevation that would cause current soil contamination to be within 1 meter of grade is not permitted unless the soil is covered with a permanent barrier. So do you think this risk condition in a certificate of compliance would require a PVP?
Thanks, Lavinia. Just remind, yeah, organizers can't vote on this one, so we won't stack the responses.
The voting has slowed down, so I will close it now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
And we'll show the results.
Oh, wow. That's interesting results. It's actually a tricky question because the condition has no reference to a soil cap that might be in place. Sometimes it's not a cap, but rather an excavation that is filled with clean soil, and some contamination is left in place. And sometimes a building is placed on top of contamination, which these are all technically considered a cap. So the answer here is yes. A PVP is required to help ensure that this condition remains in place. The PVP should include an annual inspection of any soil caps or permanent barriers in place to make sure no one removed part of it or that it is in suitable condition to prevent risk of exposure. It should also include mandatory documentation of any disturbance of soil that may have occurred on the site. And finally, the PVP should include education for new landowners or property managers on how to comply with the requirements in the PVP. Next slide, please. The next part of the presentation will focus on performance verification, plan development, and compliance. Next slide, please. Approved professionals and qualified professionals are generally hired by responsible persons to ensure that PVP instructions are followed and reporting requirements are met. However, it is ultimately the responsible person's responsibility to ensure compliance with the PVP. This is usually the landowner, but it could be the property leasee. Next slide, please. Who signs a PVP? PVPs are developed by qualified professionals and should be signed by those who develop the PVP. Qualified professionals who have contributed to the finding of the risk assessment and to the implementation of risk controls should also sign the PVP. Approved professionals review and recommend PVPs under Protocol 6, which is the protocol entitled Applications with Approved Professional Recommendations and Pre-Approvals. However, in some instances, they may be required to sign PVPs as indicated in Protocol 12, which is the protocol about site risk classification, reclassification, and reporting. Under Protocol 12, PVPs may be required when reclassifying high-risk sites to risk-managed high-risk sites. Next slide, please. To ensure risks to human health and the environment are controlled, a qualified professional preparing and signing a PVP should include a declaration that they are suitably trained and educated and are certified by their professional organization. Qualified professionals should not practice beyond their area of expertise. Next slide, please. The next part of the presentation will discuss what to include in a PVP. Next slide. The ministry expects a PVP to include the following: a description of the necessary risk controls with the rationale for their selection, the actions required to implement, operate, and monitor those risk controls, specifications on any engineering work to be implemented, a description of immediate risk of exposure to humans, the aquatic receiving environment, and terrestrial receptors if there is a sudden failure of risk controls, schedules for inspection and maintenance of any operations or any engineered works, contingency plans related to installed engineered works, notification instructions to the director if performance verification actions indicate that there is a failure of risk controls or contingency action is triggered, and identification and contact information, for example, the address and the email of those responsible for the proper operation, maintenance, and record keeping of risk control performance. An additional note is that PVPs can be modified based on the discretion of the director. A common circumstance is for a responsible person to submit an application for a change in monitoring requirements. To request a change to a PVP, submit the request as a letter to the ministry with a Contaminated Sites application form attached. Next slide, please. Responsible persons are also responsible for keeping records regarding a PVP. The director can ask to view these records for any reason. Records of risk control maintenance and monitoring activities performed on the site should include the following: a description of the inspection and maintenance work, data from the monitoring of environmental media to confirm the efficacy of works, construction activities that may have occurred, any identified failures in risk control performance along with the measures to restore their efficiency, and the quantity and quality of soil or waste managed or disposed of as part of the engineered works. Next slide, please. So this slide just represents a very general outline of a PVP. A PVP should include the following sections: a title section and a background information section, which would include the site ID, location, and the type of site it is. For example, mention if it's well, it would have to be a type 2 site. A section that describes the required risk controls. The example here, provided here, is deep rooting vegetation must not be established at the site, and the rationale behind the risk control. A section that describes the actions needed to implement the risk controls, for example, site inspections, installations, monitoring, and the frequency of monitoring to ensure that the risk controls continue to work. Contingency plans need to be indicated as well. Also include a section that describes the annual reporting requirements, and again, include those professional signatures. Next slide, please. A properly completed PVP is an important and potentially time-saving step in the application process. Some common challenges that the ministry reviewers can encounter when reviewing PVPs include the fact that the PVP is not submitted, or a PVP has been submitted, but not all the risk conditions are included in it. And the common example that was provided during this presentation, the poll question, is when practitioners omit a PVP for a soil cover. And finally, sometimes it's observed that PVPs do need a little bit more detail, particularly for high-risk sites that require complex engineering systems as a risk control. Next slide, please. Just a quick note here to check out our webpage on PVPs listed on this slide. And I think we're now open to any questions that may have come up. Okay, so I'm just going to reiterate what Natalia said. So, thank you for coming to the presentation. I just wanted a few key points. PVPs support the development, documentation, and compliance with principal risk controls. Sites that are classified as being type 2 require PVPs. If a PVP must be submitted, it needs to be detailed and accurate and up to date, please, to ensure the proper functioning of the required risk controls. And just to reiterate, contaminated sites that have risk controls do require a performance verification plan. Thank you.